Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Anxiety and Angst. Tell me about the rabbits. You got it by heart, you can do it yourself. No, you, I forget some of the things. Tell about how it's going to be. Okay, someday we're going to get the Jack together and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, and have rabbits. Go on, George, tell about what we're going to have in the garden and about the rabbits in the cages and about the rain in the winter and the stove and how thick the cream is and the milk like you can hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. John Steinbeck of Mice and Men. In order to pull a rabbit out of a hat, you must have to put it in beforehand. For some time now, I have used the metaphor of the rabbit and the hat in connection with a certain way of making something appear from analytical discourse that isn't there. I might also say that on this occasion, I have put you to the test of eating raw rabbits. You can relax now. Take a lesson from the boa constrictor, have a little nap, and the whole thing will pass through. Jacques Lacan. Well, hi everybody. I resisted the temptation to do the epigraph from Steinbeck's of Mice and Men in my cod Alabama accent. So if nothing else in this video, thank you lucky stars, you missed that. So I'm going to explore the notion of rabbits in ways you may not have thought of before. And I could start at any point. It's such a ridiculously rich field. I never thought the ideas bred like rabbits, so there'll be many rabbit puns. But this could have been 8 or 9 videos. But I'll just give you a sense of some of the ideas that I could pursue maybe in future, but there just wasn't room for here. So, for example, Donnie Darko is a movie that has a rabbit called Frank in it. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend Donnie Darko. It's thoroughly, especially if you've got a recalcitrant teenager going through bad puberty. It's a very odd film, and the miserable sods that adolescents are, they'd probably really enjoy it. But this is from The Matrix, you've probably recognised. And if you notice on the woman's, God, I'm rubbish at working out spatial relationships, but it's her left shoulder, she's got a picture of a rabbit. And the character Trinity says to Neo, who, as you'll remember, is played by Keanu Reeves, arguably the most wooden actor since Pinocchio. I really don't like him. He's less of an actor than a simulation would actually be, so maybe he was perfect for the part. But anyway, moving on from Pinocchio in a leather jacket or a leather coat, Trinity says to Neo, the Matrix has you follow the white rabbit, knock, knock, Neo. And obviously, the white rabbit, here's of this illustration, visual of it. But Morpheus says to Neo, I imagine right now you feel a bit like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So the whole notion of rabbits and going down the rabbit hole in the Matrix has obvious connotations of a weird relationship to reality and the idea that we're living in a fake reality and you need to find the truth, be red-pilled. And these are illustrations from John Tenniel, the original illustrator of Lewis Carroll's Tales. And I find the one on the right with the changed, the hand reaching for the scared rabbit is a pretty good one. And then, was this the Tim Burton film? But the white rabbit and its relationship to time. So when Alice first sees the white rabbit, it's running about anxious that it's late. And I'm going to talk about the way in which obviously this rabbit's presented in clothes. The way in which the rabbit of the imagination, which is in terms of psychoanalysis, we'll find out shortly, is it's actually used in quite a profoundly deep way, but there's also this anthropomorphization, in other words, giving human characteristics to the rabbit figures. And that's interesting to the extent that rabbits are really not particularly human-like. They lend themselves to this anthropomorphization all the time. So I'll be exploring that. And just to give you I'm just going to now quickly show you a range of images just to show you just the ridiculous scope of how many aspects of our culture are rabbit infested. So this is I actually think that the Teletubbies marked in the beginning of the end in our culture. So I may well do in future. There's a controversial book, but I think it's actually an interesting one by Oswald Spengler called The Decline of the West. About, as the name implies, it was written in the 30s, 1930s, I think. But it's about, as the name obviously implies, the decline of cultural standards, the fact that cultures go in waves and cycles. If you wanted proof that we've become an illiterate society and our children are being brainwashed in banality, I think the Teletubbies, although I have some empathy because I increasingly look like one, but they went through, there's various rabbit, if you've studied your Teletubbies, they went through various rabbit phases, as you can see here. And then I believe these are called, I'm sorry if I've got it wrong, but I think they're Flemish giant rabbits. And because the costumes of the Teletubbies make them look so big, in order to make the rabbits not look minuscule, they actually had to use these oversized, greedy bugger rabbits. God, how much must that eat a day? I don't think that's got that size on lettuce alone. They probably eat smaller rabbits for all I know. But anyway. And then, so this is still childhood references, and obviously there's Peter Rabbit, Beatrix Potter and all that. I'll talk later about Br'er Rabbit. There's just endless references. But then there's also the sexual connotations. So the whole bunny rabbit, Playboy empire, Hugh Hefner. And then there's a relatively recent anime, which with the, very concise and not weird title at all. Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai. And I won't go in, I don't want to get the channel taken off the air, so I won't go into the etymological roots of a certain lady part that is actually also based on the French word for rabbit. So if you want to look that up on your own, I won't go into it, so to speak, because, like I say, it's a clean family program, this. But this is from that anime. And what's interesting is, one of the themes of this anime is, it's called either puberty syndrome or adolescent syndrome. And I won't go and bore you with the details of the anime, but the idea is that only this male character can see this woman loses. She's a famous actress, is the idea of the character, but people begin not to be able to see her. And then there are various other, it's a bit like magic realism in a Japanese context. It's a weird temporary syndrome that makes magical realist things happen. So scientifically impossible things just start happening routinely. And it's linked to high schoolers with emotional and psychological issues, hence the puberty syndrome. And I think issues that arise in this series are body swapping, time loops, having a double. We've just looked at on the channel, the doppelganger idea in the, The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman. Strange marks appearing on your flesh, all weird things, as you'd expect from anime. But I think it's interesting, the loneliness that anime, I've spoken about it before, that anime often depicts, and the idea that almost like the Warren-like, rabbit-like behavior of people. There's a subgenre, if you're not aware of it, on YouTube. If you ever want to just be very relaxed, it's Tokyo Salarymen. There's this weird subgenre where they make videos of their daily life and how it's killing them and how it makes them really miserable, and they'll go off at lunchtime and film themselves eating a sandwich, and you never actually see them. It's always just point of view camera work, but they'll eat a sandwich and that's the highlight of their day. Or they get home at 1 o'clock in the morning having worked 14 hours and cook themselves noodles. And it's weirdly relaxing because the pace of these videos are just so low key. And you just think, thank God that's not me. But this wider issue about isolation and anomie that I've spoke about in a previous anime discussion video, I think it's an interesting thing. And it just struck me as the bunny rabbit, bunny girl, it's even present in anime. And like Donnie Darko and like Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Going Down the Rabbit Hole, bunny rabbits tend to get associated bizarrely, or they have through our culture, with time travel, with, as we'll see shortly with reference to Freud and Lacan, changing conceptions of reality in quite weird ways. And then just on a lighter note, I just want to give you a range of references. This was a 1970s video in the UK. It was the Cadbury's bunny who had for copyright or whatever, I prefer just to show images rather than try and get into the video thing, because the more technology I use, just the more ridiculously inept I become. But the bunny rabbit, I don't know whether I can say this, had an incredibly sexy voice. And this was weirdly targeted at, I don't know whether it was children or their parents. And it was quite amusing. But then please, the next few images, please just indulge me, because this set me off down the rabbit hole of erotica in the chocolate industry. So this was, again, I think this was 70s or 80s, but there was a whole series, and please go on YouTube. And if you're a man, make sure your wife's not watching. But there were just a number of adverts where these women ate chocolate, as you do, in the bath in this case. And I think when she finishes eating, or at one point the bath overflows, and that's not symbolic at all. I won't show you lots and lots of images, but I think this was my favourite of all time, because as the crumbliest, flakiest chocolate ever created, what you don't see from that picture is she's actually, as you do, you go in a boat, don't you, and you eat chocolate, and you go into a lagoon that, helpfully has a waterfall that you're so immersed in eating the chocolate you completely forget about, and you go through, and again, completely non-symbolically, you're obviously drenched, and then you lean back, spent, after you've eaten your chocolate, and are absolutely drenched. And this was on mainstream British television. And like I say, adults and children, we all enjoyed our Cadbury's Flake advert. And why I mention it partly is, I'm obviously seeking fond memories of my perverted childhood, but also the way in which modern TV, contemporary TV, to the extent that I watch it anymore, which is rare because I just watch Netflix and stuff, but there are various dating programs with naked contestants all the time. And I'm suggesting that these type of adverts were, at a symbolic level, absolutely filthy, but it's done in such a way that the symbolism makes it permissible to be shown. And actually, I'd argue it's much more erotic than all these endlessly tattooed nubile adolescents or early 20s who completely infest these reality programs, dating programs, when they all get their kit off from the get-go. Anyway, I'm getting all worked up here. And then during my research, I found out, I think this is called Rabbit Seasoning from 1952, but the extent to which Bugs Bunny is a icon in the cross-dressing community. I didn't realise the number of times Bugs Bunny experimented with his, her gender. I can never remember, did he say, I say, or was that the rooster? But anyway, you get the idea, and Bugs Bunny was not averse to experimenting with gender, so well ahead of his, her time. And then did this amuse me? Before we get into the heavy stuff, just please indulge me to partly explain why British people of a certain age are the way we are. Because this was from a program called Pipkins, which was a children's program, and this was the puppet. This moth-eaten, looks like it's got third-degree lice. And it's just incredibly, you know, how a whole generation of British kids weren't traumatized. We probably were, actually, because this is what we got to see on television. Anyway, that was a trip down memory lane and a half. But one of the ideas, and you can speculate as to why rabbits lend themselves to so many, as we'll see as we go along, projections, psychological projections. But one is, if you think of Plato's cave and the idea that in Plato's Republic he talks about the allegory of the cave and people are looking at shadows of reality. Well, just to do, the rabbit seems to lend itself to the most basic shadow shapes. And I came across this interesting image of the rabbit imitating the human hand, which appealed to my sense of humour. But now let's get stuck into the serious stuff. I've bribed you with chocolate adverts. Now it gets a bit more difficult. So this is from a paper, Look at the Bunny, the Rabbit as Virtual Totem. Interestingly, the proleptic powers of Plato extend as far into the future as the Academy Awards, as witnessed in the section which reads, he's talking about Plato's Republic. And if they're in the habit of conferring honours among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honours and glories, or envy the possessor of them? And the authors Clemens and Petman make this comparison with the enlightened Keanu Reeves, Jim Carrey type figure who's escaped the cave, Matrix, or Sea Haven, which I think's the Jim Carrey film. Excuse me. This idea of being trapped in a simulated reality. I've had a senior brain aneurysm moment. I can't for the life of me. It'll come to me later what the Jim Carrey film was, so you can all just shout at the screen now. But this idea of being trapped in this Plato's-like cave environment. Thus, those figures who refuse to accept their Oscar statuette, like Marlon Brando and George C. Scott, subconsciously play the role of the Platonic character who has escaped the seductive irrelevance of the shadows to become the exceptional person who refuses to look at the bunny. So in this article, Clemens and Petman take the idea of look at the bunny, as you can see from the title of their article. And it's the type of thing you say to children when you want to distract them. Look at the bunny. So if you're getting an injection at the doctor's, whatever, you say to the little kid, oh, look at the bunny. And you try and distract them with a hand gesture or a puppet or whatever. And they're making the point, Clemens and Petman, that since time immemorial, since the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, this idea of people being distracted from the truth and being distracted by shadows and our relationship with projections has been there, like I say, from the very earliest days of human culture. You can imagine the first cave people playing with the shadows on the wall. So this is Who Framed Roger Rabbit from 1988, and I want to show you this partly because I'll be talking about Jessica Rabbit, ding dong, later on, because again, that type of archetype. But it's interesting that Jessica Rabbit is in this film about the rabbit, and again, back to the whole bunny girl archetype. And it's interesting for the nerds amongst you, so this was from 1988, and there's actually graffiti in the film for the more sharp-eyed amongst you, where it says on this piece of graffiti, for a good time, call Allison Wonderland. Allison spelled Alllyson. So again, this idea of going down rabbit holes the idea of losing a sense of reality, because the whole film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, as you probably well know, is all about, I think they're called toons, aren't they? The characters who are actual cartoon characters. And I think Jessica Rabbit is partly human, partly animated character in the story. And then you have the actual Bob Hoskins, the human being, and it's all about this relating to representations of reality. And Bob Hoskins, the actual real world actor, was asked about playing the role. What was it like to do a film that obviously takes months of filming time? And he was asked, psychologically, how do you adapt? And so he starts talking about this experience. So he talks about his daughter, and he says she was 3 at the time when he's making the film, and she had all these invisible friends whom she talks to, Jeffrey and Elliot. And I realised that as we get older, our imagination goes further and further to the back of our head. When we're a kid, we can actually take it out and look at it. I mean, we can see it. As we get older, senility comes in. Truman Show. See what I mean about senility? Just remembered. And the imagination comes to the forefront again and takes over. So I just concentrated on an immature imagination, forcing it back to the front so I could actually take it out and look at it. And I managed to actually see them, which was all right. But you do it for 16 hours a day for 5 months. I started to lose control and hallucinate in all kinds of embarrassing places. Some of it's quite rude, but there's not much you can talk about. At one point, it was quite frightening. Weasels and all sorts of things turning up. So he basically has this dissociative experience because he's been playing with the idea of imaginary figures for too long. And then this is a quote from Ed Jones, who was the optical photography supervisor of the actual film. And he said all of us were Looney Tunes by the end of it. And the guy in the red, he is Charles Fleischer, or Flesher, but I think it's Fleischer. And he did the voice for the rabbit. And he actually wore the costume the whole time. And I think the other actors found it very, very odd, but he also completely, talk about method acting. He thought that he had to dress up as Roger Rabbit to really fully perform the role. So he's the only, he's never appearing on screen as himself, but he decided to dress up for 5 months as a rabbit in overalls. Perfectly normal behavior. So to talk about non-normal behavior, I fully recommend, this will be on various streaming services, but the film Harvey from 1950. And James Stewart's one of my all-time favourite actors just because he's in 2 of my favourite Hitchcock films, Vertigo and Rear Window. But this is about, and you see the whole Plato's cave idea of the shadows in the background, but he has this imaginary rabbit that goes around with him. And having said this, as I'm thinking, there was a recent Netflix series, wasn't there, called Eric, which wasn't a rabbit, but it's another imaginary creature. I think there'll be loads, you'll be able to think, I'm sure, of loads of other examples of fictional creations based upon these animal-like alter egos. But it's a brilliantly done film, and I just something about 1950s black and white films, the crispness, I think you'd call it, chiaroscuro, the black and white of the film. It's just so much nicer than watching the coldness of increasingly CGI-driven films. But Veta is the sister of the main character who has Harvey as his friend. And she's saying to the doctor who's treating him, because they eventually get fed up of him pretending, so he gets taken off to be treated. But I took a class last winter. I learned the difference between a fine oil painting and a mechanical thing like a photograph. The photograph shows only the reality. The painting shows not only the reality, but the dream behind it. It's our dreams, Doctor, that carry us on. They separate us from the beasts. I wouldn't want to go on living if I thought it was all just eating and sleeping and taking my clothes off. I mean, putting them on. So it's brilliantly written as a script, because she's obviously made a Freudian slip there to a psychiatrist. So there's a joke there, but also there's an interesting reference, because she's referring essentially to the Walter Benjamin essay from 1935, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which talks about the difference between a photograph and an actual work of art, which I think I've mentioned in previous videos. And there's just another promotional shot for the film. And I just think it's interesting because, as we'll shortly see, these are some quite complex psychological issues that the film doesn't really address in detail, but actually is alluding to. And this is what I loved about 1950s and 60s films, is especially by Hitchcock, the degree of psychological complexity. But Hitchcock was producing these films in mainstream Hollywood, and he was an incredibly successful director. And it's one of the reasons I'm so fixated on Hitchcock, because I can't think of many other directors. There have been some amazing directors, but there have been very, very few directors who've straddled both mainstream acceptability and commercial success, and produced films of incredible psychological depth. So if you can think of any, shout out in the comment section. But I just hasten to add, it's the combination I'm interested in of A, deep films, but B, a Hitchcock. Every time there's a new Hitchcock film in those days, it was a major cultural event for the masses, not just the Pionsons, or whatever they're called, the high thinkers, good thinkers. And this is Elwood, the actual guy who's got the rabbit friend, Harvey. Did I tell you he could stop clocks? And Dr. Chumley says, to what purpose? Well, you can go anywhere you like, with anyone you like, and stay as long as you like. When you get back, not 1 minute will have ticked by. You see, science has overcome time and space, but Harvey has not only overcome time and space, but any objections. And that's interesting, because there's a slight innuendo of you can stop time. I think it's the technical term when you stop time like that is a fermata. I think it's a phrase from music when there's a caesura or a stop in the music. And there was a guy, was it Nicholson Baker, wrote a novel years ago called Fermata, which is quite funny. Because it's quite puerile. He's able to stop time, and he does whatever an adolescent boy would do if they're able to stop time and start it again, and no one know what had happened. So read it for yourself. But that's the implication, that he's actually saying there wouldn't be any objections. So there's no moral objections. This is actually a more psychologically relevant point than it would just seem at first sight. And then you see in the film he's looking at his own portrait with Harvey included. And then there's another doctor. Trauma, it means shock. There's nothing unusual about it. There's the birth trauma, the shock of being born. And Elwood says that's the one we never get over. Which again, because that from memory is Otto Rank. I mentioned him in the previous video about the Hoffman story, The Sandman. But he wrote a book called The Double, and he was a psychoanalyst who, you could say this about loads of people. Initially, he was a colleague of Freud and a good collaborator and a good friend, but they fell out. And one of the reasons was Harvey, that was a Freudian senile bit, not Harvey, Otto Rank. He believed that the major psychological effect on us is the trauma of being born. We never fully get over it because we're in this amniotic sac of absolute peace, and suddenly we're thrown out screaming, blood everywhere, and we have to deal with reality and we never get over it, and some of us never do. But Freud was much more about we're driven by the drives, our instinct, our libido. So that was one difference that led to them splitting. I just think there's some beautiful. I mentioned earlier the chiaroscuro, the black and white films, unsurprisingly, but it's just beautiful. The depth and the reflection off the wood you can see, and obviously he's talking to his very large imaginary rabbit friend. So to relate all this to actual hardcore psychoanalysis and Freud wrote the following in a paper called Negation from 1925. It is no longer a question of whether what has been perceived, a thing, shall be taken into the ego or not, but of whether something which is in the ego as a presentation can be rediscovered in perception, reality, as well. It is, we see once more, a question of internal and external. What is unreal, merely a presentation and subjective, is only internal. What is real is also there outside. In order to understand this step forward, we must recollect that all presentations originate from perceptions and are repetitions of them. So that's all very wordy, but I picked it out because I've italicized and emboldened this internal, external, because that's what I was talking about in the previous video. And that's what largely the Hoffman-Sandman story was about. The inability of Nathaniel, the main character, to be able to live in the world with his own internal feelings and be able to match the two without having this dissociative psychological disturbance. And this relates to the first bit, and I'll explain as we go along, but I also mentioned in the previous video the concept of the palimpsest, the document that's already been written on. So Freud was developing this concept of how human beings, the way our brain works, are unusual because we also have to process not just immediate perceptions of our immediate environment. We also have to process memories that come and go, and this notion of recalling. So in what he says here at the end, in order to understand the step forward, we must recollect that all presentations originate from perceptions. So presentation is an idea in our heads, an imaginative conceptualization, and they originate from the perceptions of the real world outside us. But thereafter, once they've entered our memory banks, or once they've entered our brains, often pre-consciously or subconsciously, they reappear, or we process them and they remain part of our brain to varying degrees of consciousness. So immediately, this internal versus external. For the human psyche, there isn't just this basic, we are recorders of an external reality, like recording devices. The internal external is much more subtly linked together. So thinking possesses the capacity to bring before the mind once more something that has once been perceived, which I think is what I just said, by reproducing it as a presentation without the external object having still to be there. Catch up, Sigmund, I said that. The first and foremost aim of all reality testing is not to find an object in real perception which corresponds to the one presented, but to refine such an object to convince oneself that it is still there. So it's one of the things I think is most significant about psychoanalysis, and why, despite its mad as a box of frogs aspects, psychoanalysis still is very important, because there are too many people who follow the scientific dogma that there's an external objective scientific world and we as human beings just passively record it. And if you are susceptible to spirituality or artistic beauty, that doesn't count as reality in the scientific sense. And what I think psychoanalysis in Freud's quote here suggests is the human brain does not work, as I've said, like a recorder, an automaton, again, which was a theme of the Sandman story. The human brain is this inextricable merging of the internal and the external. So instincts, according to Lacan, and this is how Lacan develops Freud's ideas, drift as opposed to drive. And they direct us towards the mythic point that has been articulated in terms of the object relation. Drives for Lacan do not seek an object directly. The aim of a drive is to drift in such a way as to seek a condition of repetitive circular movement around its object. But how does one get from the object to das Ding? So don't worry, I'll explain all this. Freud's theory was mostly based on the concept of instincts and drive. So our id is what really drives us. Our ego is what tries to control it. And our superego is this annoying, nagging voice like our conscience or guilt that keeps telling you, no matter how well you're doing, it's not good enough. You know, who do you think you are? So I'm sharing too much now, my inner voice. But the idea is that the superego is largely irrational and asks of the ego things that often the ego isn't capable of producing. So that's on top, and then underneath you've got the id. It's like me faced with a ribeye steak. It's this slavering animal that the ego is also trying to control. So you've got the neurotic Woody Allen type voice in your head, or you've got the caveman slavering over whatever your equivalent of a ribeye steak is. And that's what the ego is trying to constantly control, these two extremes. And it's interesting, the aim of so what Lacan does to Freud's work is just nuance it, rather than this instinctive drives that we're trying to control, the libido, the urge to eat a ribeye. I haven't had my dinner yet, I shouldn't do this. But the notion of, for Lacan, the drift, the derive, is not as blatant or as obvious as the drive. And the drift is in such a way as to seek a condition of repetitive circular movement around its object. And that precisely describes and explains what the character in The Sandman, Nathaniel, does. He circles around the object of his desire that starts off as Clara, but becomes this automaton, Olympia. And the das Ding, how does one get from the object to das Ding? Das Ding is the thing. And trying to do this quickly, but Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, German philosopher, had the notion of Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is this, we can never know what objects are beyond the human brain. So it's like the idea, if a tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? We can only experience objects as our perceptive apparatus allows us to experience them. We cannot know what a rock is to itself, or what a rock really is, other than our human ability to perceive it. So the idea was, according to Kant, we experience things on a phenomenal basis as phenomena suitable for the human perceptive apparatus. But there's this notion of the noumenal, things in themselves. Ding an sich, and the das Ding is Lacan's version of that. We can only understand reality through our representations of reality, and for Lacan, that was particularly language is incredibly important. It's the only reason for Lacan that we can engage with an external reality. And das Ding is what lies beyond language, because language can't ultimately fully succeed. So Lacan, using the analogy of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, provides the following enigmatic response. In effect, the rabbit is to be conjured from the hat. The rabbit to be conjured from the hat is to be already found in the instinct. The rabbit is not a new object. It is a change of object in itself. If the drive allows the change of object, it is because it is already marked by the articulation of the signifier. The properly metonymic relation between one signifier and another that we call desire is not a new object or a previous object, but the change of object in itself. just to quickly explain, metonymic is, and metonymy is to say, for example, has your ride arrived yet? It's shortening. So instead of saying, has the car that's going to take you home arrived, you use something that is associated with the thing you're referring to, but isn't the thing itself. So you use the word ride instead of car. There's a subdivision within metonymy, which is synecdoche, which is you use a small aspect of the thing you're referring to refer to the whole. So that would be, where are your wheels, meaning where is your car? The wheels represent the car itself. So that's synecdoche, and metonymy is closely related. And then on another occasion, I'll explain, metaphor is related to metonymy, and according to people like Freud and Lacan, this is a crucial way in which language and the unconscious works. The unconscious works using metaphor and metonymic ways of thinking. So what Lacan seems to be saying here, and it's hardly coincidental that he is using the language of a magician, is that there exists the ability to access the real via the symbolic order through a process that, while rooted in the symbolic order, can somehow at the same time pass through the symbolic order. As one commentator has described it, the real exceeds the symbolic, but the latter provides the only access to the former. Thus, access to the real is only achieved through a form of symbolic sublimation that traces the excess within symbolization. There is no direct access to the real, only an oblique passage. So I'm sorry this is so complicated, but A, I'm going to explain it more, and B, by referring back to things like Harvey the Big White Rabbit, I'm going to try and make more of this understandable. But ultimately what he's trying to say is that it's what I just mentioned, that language can never fully capture our experience of reality. The real exceeds the symbolic. The latter provides the only access to the former. So you need the symbolic realm of language to access the real at all, but you can never do it completely because language is imperfect. Language can't contain full human experience. But as was mentioned earlier, this idea that this is linked to the notion of desire, because this failure, this something lacking, is also part of what makes us desire things. And the previous quote was all about the object isn't so much the issue. Desire is about not even different objects. Desire is about the process itself, that you can apply your desire to all these different objects. So a philandering man, for example, don't know why that example came to my head. It's not that any woman would do, but it's the idea that it's the process of falling, inverted commas, in love, or having all these sexual partners. It's the revolving process. The sense of desire can apply itself to all these different representations of desire, because that's how desire works. It's not actually about the objects themselves. Likewise, there's no direct access to the real, only an oblique passage. So I know this is complicated, and I know it's not particularly easy to get your head around, but I'm picking on this because this notion of there's no direct access to the real, only an oblique passage, this explains why characters like Elwood in the film Harvey need this white rabbit. It's almost, for a normal, well-adjusted person, this inability to access the real reality beyond language is this mind-boggling thing. And some people deal with it like small children do, as Bob Hoskins was talking about. You have imaginary friends. You have an imagination that can cope with the limitations of language. And ironically, as we become adults, we lose some of this ability. So in some sense, what Elwood is doing in the film Harvey is psychologically healthier, because then it doesn't lead to a complete mental breakdown. You might say, well, imagining there's a white rabbit following you around isn't particularly healthy. But Elwood, the character, is very well adjusted and happy in a certain sense. And it's the people who are so tightly wound, achieving so much in life, who don't have any problems, they're the ones arguably to look out for. So Lacan's notion of das Ding is indeed problematic. We are projected into something that is far beyond the domain of affectivity, something moving, obscure, and without reference points. Das Ding is present only in the form of an absence, a gravitational pull or centripetal force drawing upon the signifying chain. A recognition of Lacan's commitment to a necessary yet oblique connection between the symbolic order and the ineffable das Ding helps us to understand his provocative claim that the zone Oedipus entered after having scratched out his eyes needs to be explored. The pressing issue confronting neo-Lacanians is the extent to which such blindness can lead to insight. So, again, it all seems to be very complicated, and I'm only showing you this. I wouldn't worry if it's difficult to get your head around, but I'm trying to give you some sense of theorists like Lacan and Freud racking their brains to describe how human beings who have this imaginative capacity and who have memories and who have a brain that, yes, is capable of recording external reality, but also is much more than that. And again, I always refer back to Ian McGilchrist's work on left brain versus right hemisphere functions of our brain. The well-adjusted brain is bicameral. It adapts to both the more left side of our brain, which controls calculation, which is as similar to scientific measurement. That's how the world has increasingly gone. The right hemisphere of our brain allows us to imagine things, to use metaphor, as I explained earlier, and a properly well-adjusted bicameral brain, a laterally working brain, allows you to have a healthy relationship to maintaining this boundary between the internal and the external. When that boundary breaks down, that's when mental problems occur. And this quote, I won't go into maybe on another occasion, but the Oedipus reference is because Oedipus tries, the irony is in the Oedipus story, he tries to deal with reality, and he tries not to fall prey to the prediction that tragedy will befall him. So he tries to enter the real world, the external world around him, and he tries to take control of his own fate. And every step he takes along the way makes things worse. It makes the fateful prediction more likely to happen, not less. So he actually runs into the problem rather than staying away from it. And later, when he actually, all these terrible things happen, so he kills his father, has unbeknownst to him, has an incestuous relationship with his own mother. He then blinds himself. But thereafter, one interpretation is he's then, because he's not distracted by all these representations of an external reality that initially confused him, to a certain extent, he's then closer to the inner truth of his own existence. So again, this relationship between internal, external. And it's this paradoxical, this provocative claim that such blindness can lead to insight. And in a modern context, the argument would be perhaps that we're inundated with images, we're inundated with representations, and our inner sense, our inner insight is lacking. So if the word is the magic and indispensable key which alone grants us access to the world of symbolization. So this is how Lacan links all of this, if you've kept with me so far, to the concept of anxiety. It seems to me that anxiety occurs precisely at the moment when this key no longer opens any door. So this is what I was saying about the breakdown between the symbolic and the external reality, which normally is mediated through language. When the ego, the me, must come face to face with that which is behind or before all symbolization. So our inner self before you try and articulate anything. When that which appears is that which is without a name, this mysterious figure, this place from which a desire arises which one can no longer apprehend, where for the subject a kind of telescoping occurs between fantasy and reality. The symbolic fades, giving way to fantasy as such. The ego dissolves, and it is this dissolution which we call anxiety. So for people suffering from anxiety, this is why Elwood doesn't. Elwood has experienced potentially something like this breakdown in symbolization, but he's replaced it with Harvey, this oversized rabbit. People who've lost touch with that imaginative response or solution, they've lost the ability to mediate between their internal self and the external, but they also lack the imaginative solutions that some people might interpret as unhealthy. It's not healthy to see a white rabbit everywhere, but if it keeps you in a certain sense mentally stable despite the white rabbit you're seeing, it's better than nothing. And it's the way it's portrayed in the film, at least. Elwood is not an anxious person. So this is the last bit of text before luckily we'll get back onto some images. In order to pull a rabbit out of a hat, one must first put him in. That was the quote from earlier from Lacan. I wonder then if anxiety appears not only when the rabbit comes out, but when he has gone off to browse in the grass. When the hat now only represents something which looks like a torus, which I'll explain in a second, which surrounds a black hole from which all nameable content has disappeared, faced with which the ego no longer has any point of reference, because the first thing one can say about anxiety is that its appearance is the sign of the momentary collapse of all possible identificatory terms of reference. So again, Lacan's relating the experience of anxiety to this notion of momentary collapse of identificatory terms of reference. So there's earlier on, he develops the rabbit idea and he says the rabbit comes out, but when he's gone off to browse in the grass, when the hat now only represents something which looks like a torus, and a torus is a donut-shaped, geometric shape like this. And what he's suggesting is at the heart of reality, the things that can't be named, the things that language can't approach. So, ironically, literature uses language to say the things that can't be said. Art uses canvases and oils to try to paint the things that can't be said. And both literature and art will never fully present it. But as was pointed out earlier, arguably they're better at presenting what can't be shown than a photograph is. A photograph only shows what's there. A portrait shows what's underlying, the essence of a character of someone. So arguably a portrait can be much more revealing of the true person than the much more chemically, technically accurate photograph. So when I say chemically, the way photographs used to be developed, now it would be digitally. You know, a perfect digital representation of an image may not tell you as well as a portrait would what the character of the person being depicted is. So this is the torus that was referred to, this idea that, sorry, if we go back to, so the rabbit and the hat now only represents something which looks like a torus which surrounds a black hole from which all nameable content has disappeared. So I'm going to explore this because this also has relevance. I said, for example, I hadn't got time to look at Donnie Darko, but Donnie Darko, the film, is all about not just time travel, but these holes in reality. It would probably be the simplest way to explain one of the major themes of Donnie Darko, which is a very enigmatic film. But this is the combination of this image of the Taurus and the previous description from Lacan. I think that's what he's trying to describe. And then to give you an example, which I'll explain as we go along, this is an image from Fellini's film La Dolce Vita. And it's, again, if you can check it out, if nothing else, go on YouTube, and if you check out the opening scene and the final scene, they're two of my favourite scenes in the whole of cinematic history. But at the beginning, a ridiculous size, huge statue of Jesus is being transported by helicopter. And it's the opening of the film. You see it travel through Rome. So it goes through the outskirts, and you see the viaduct that the ancient Romans created. The symbolism's just absolutely amazing, and it's very funny also, without using any national stereotypes. As they're flying, there's more than one helicopter from memory. I think one's to guide the other one, but they go over some rooftops, and there's some Italian women sunbathing. So there's this huge statue of Jesus being suspended from a helicopter, and they're trying to get the phone number of the two women below. And then this is the famous scene from the fountain in Rome. And I'd suggest this has the connotations of the Jessica Rabbit figure. The Treviso, it's the Treviso, isn't it? The fountain in Rome. And it's just stunningly, like my aesthetic terminology for this image, and the next one would just be ding dong. But why I mention all this is it starts with a religious image. You then have La Dolce Vita. Marcello, the character, lives this debauched life with models and so on. And at the very end, you get this weird image. They're on a beach, and the fishermen have brought in this strange fish creature that isn't native to the area. And it's this huge eye, which reminded me of the Taurus in the previous discussion. And Marcello looks at it, and he actually says, it insists on looking. It's this weird Taurus-like hole in the middle of symbolic reality. But to link all this back to the concept, I'm saying there's a link there with the notion of, I've forgotten her name, the actress, but the Jessica Rabbit ahead of her time, that character. And that represents the way in which La Dolce Vita, he's in the entertainment industry that was growing in Italy. So it's the film industry, the TV industry, the superficiality, and it's sandwiched between the first image of the film being the statue of Christ, and then there's fish imagery in Christianity. But there's this dead eye at the end of the film, and him looking at it. And it's this gap in meaning, like the Taurus you saw earlier. But to get this back to Mice and Men and to start to wrap up, evening of a hot day started, the little winter moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills towards the top. On the sandbanks the rabbits sat as quietly as little grey sculptured stones. And then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noiselessly for cover. So I'm suggesting in La Dolce Vita you're seeing the rabbit, Jessica Rabbit character. And then this is the ambivalence of the whole rabbit psyche, these images that it evokes. Because it's an incredibly poignant story. So it starts off very early with the rabbits exist from the very beginning, and then the rabbit theme is all about, there are two main characters. George is the protective friend, and Lenny is basically special needs, mentally not fully developed, but this massive, strong guy. And that's his downfall. He's inadvertently kills lots of things by accident because he's just too ridiculously powerful. But his anxiety, his way of dealing with this notion of the torus, the hole in reality, this failure to understand or be able to symbolize. In the previous image of Marcello from La Dolce Vita on the beach, he's tried to fill the gap with this extravagant lifestyle. But Lenny, his anxiety is he's constantly stressed, partly because of his learning difficulties, but partly because he's just, well, mostly because of his learning difficulties. He's a misfit. He's this huge, gentle giant who keeps inadvertently getting into trouble and not being able to rationalize his way out of it. So, okay, I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well spend all my time telling you things. And then this is George. And then you forget him and I tell you again. Tried and tried, said Lenny, but it didn't do no good. I remember about the rabbits, George. The hell with the rabbits. That's all you ever can remember is them rabbits. Okay, now you listen. And this time you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. So this is George uses the notion of the rabbits. The idea that they're going to buy a house, the previous quote I gave you at the very beginning. George pacifies Lenny by telling him, we're going to buy a house, we're going to have rabbits, everything's going to be okay. And that's what Lenny always fixates on, and that's what calms him down. And if he's repeatedly told about it, that helps him rationalize his situation to the limited ability he's able to rationalize. But the poignancy, I'd argue, is that that's what we all do. We all need this image. And then later on, towards the end of it, the very tragic story, he has what's basically a dissociative series of thoughts. So one, Aunt Clara, who gave him, I think it's from the story, gave him little mice when he just liked to stroke animals, and he liked the sensation of the breathing animal, and she used to give him mice, but he'd kill them all by accident. So this is the tragedy all the time. So he starts thinking of her towards the end. So that's what's being referred to next. And then from out of Lenny's head there came a little fat old woman. Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice too. Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit, talking about George. He's going to beat the hell out of you and then go away and leave you. He won't, Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. So this rabbit becomes almost the superego. It's this horrible injunction berating and browbeating poor Lenny. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, he gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave you, crazy bastard. So that's it's horrible, the ending, and this is the sublime notion of art, that of Mice and Men as such a sad yet simultaneously beautiful story. And again, the next idea would be Watership Down, to give you an example of how literature uses this image of the rabbit. And one thing I'd say immediately is that Watership Down is so, again, like of Mice and Men, so sad in various parts. And what's absolutely shocking is it starts with Aeschylus's, what's the Agamemnon, the play. It starts with a quote all about that I can smell death like the tomb. There's an epigraph at the beginning, the very beginning of a children's tale. I think it's supposed to be. It was about 8 years and upwards at the time. It came out in 1974, and it starts off with a Greek tragic epigraph, and all the way through are these really good epigraphs and some of the subtlety of the writing and some of the adult themes in a book for children. And I would argue strongly that university students, in my experience, increasingly couldn't tolerate something even like Watership Down. It's what happens in a post-literate society. Suddenly, so Fiver's one of the rabbits, one of the characters. Suddenly, Fiver shivered and cowered down. Oh, Hazel, that's another rabbit. This is where it comes from. I know now, something very bad, some terrible thing, coming closer and closer. He began to whimper with fear. What sort of thing? What do you mean? I thought you said there was no danger. I don't know what it is, answered Fiver wretchedly. There isn't any danger here at this moment, but it's coming. It's coming. Oh, Hazel, look, the field, it's covered with blood. Don't be silly. It's only the light of the sunset. Fiver, come on, don't talk like this. You're frightening me. And I'll just ask you to think of the next picture I'm going to show you that's from the film Watership Down, I think it was 1978, the animated film they made. This reminded me of when I did the video on Against the Machine by Paul Kingsnorth. What Fiver the rabbit is actually experiencing is the unstoppable movement of the machine. They're in a field and he gets a premonition of the development, the machine ploughing through the countryside, literally and metaphorically. But don't be silly, it's only the light of the sunset, Fiver. Come on, don't talk like this, you're frightening me. But that's how he sees it. The sun set behind the opposite slope. The wind turned colder with a scatter of rain, and in less than an hour it was dark. All colour had faded from the sky, and although the big board by the gate creaked slightly in the night wind, as though to insist that it had not disappeared in the darkness, but was still firmly where it had been put, there was no passer-by to read the sharp, hard letters that cut straight as black knives across its white surface. They said, "This ideally situated estate, comprising 6 acres of excellent building land, is to be developed with high-class modern residences by Such and Martin Limited of Newbury, Berkshire." And just to repeat the idea that that's aimed at children, it was in the 1970s. I just think it shows how far we've moved, and this is an aspect of literacy. Art is able to make even small children consider quite traumatic things, and the more we've moved away from that, what a surprise. We have an incredibly easily triggered and easily traumatized generation of people, as Jonathan Haidt would point out, as I always refer to his work on the anxious generation. And then I wanted to show you the next quote because it absolutely summarizes to me one of my pet peeves and themes about bureaucracy, because they go to another warren, and what they find is this other warren, I think they call them these singers, these other rabbits. The local farmer uses traps, that's what's referred to in the quote as wires, shining wires, but he basically keeps culling them, but they're in denial because apart from that it's the perfect warren system, so they just deny that it's happening. And it's this crowd mentality that I think is when bureaucracies close ranks and they don't want to confront the truth. I think this is a brilliant description. And since they could not bear the truth, these singers, who might in some other place have been wise, were squeezed under the terrible weight of the Warren secret until they gulped out fine folly about dignity and acquiescence and anything else that could make believe that the rabbit loved the shining wire. But one strict rule they had, oh yes, the strictest. No one must ever ask where another rabbit was, and anyone who asked where, except in a song or poem, must be silent. To say where was bad enough, but to speak openly of the wires, that was intolerable. For that, they would scratch and kill. I think that's a brilliant description of denial. The force with which a group can actually internalize, and anyone who actually tells the truth becomes the enemy. I think it's incredibly insightful. So I'll just finish with, this is an image of Br'er Rabbit, and it's the final example I'll give of the applicability of rabbit references and the subtlety with which Br'er Rabbit is all about slyness and being able to defeat a stronger enemy. And up until now, one of the aspects of rabbits are their vulnerability, which I'll get onto in a second. Very docile, very pliant animals. But also in Native American mythology and West African mythology that led to Br'er Rabbit. I think it was Joel Chandler Harris was the person who popularized these previously West African stories for the black population in America. But it's an interesting sub-theme that on another occasion I'll go into much more depth on. This is it's the front cover of the Penguin edition, Modern Classics edition of Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, which I can't praise highly enough. It's brilliant. And Ralph Ellison, he did a collaboration with Gordon Parks. I think this is a photograph from that collaboration. Gordon Parks was a black photographer. And I think that the collection was called Harlem is Nowhere, where this photograph is from. And then in 1952, Invisible Man was published. And it's a brilliant, funny, and dark and depressing at the same time book. So I won't give you it's too complicated to go into the whole story, but basically the narrator, who's never named, is this invisible man. He's not seen by white society. He's given a scholarship at a black university that's funded by these white, rich philanthropists. And he's asked to show one of the trustees, one of these rich donors around. And the donor is called Norton, Mr. Norton. And it's hilarious. The funny bit is when Norton asks to see some of the local area, and the narrator makes the mistake of taking him down some of the back streets in the poor black area. And one of the guys, I think he's called True Blood, but he's this guy who's infamous in the local community for having impregnated his daughter. And when he mentions that, Norton wants to speak to him, bizarrely. So he goes to speak to this incestuous father. And then I think he faints or he has a reaction. So the narrator has to take him to a tavern that also doubles as a brothel. And it's on the same day that veteran black soldiers who are traumatized in a local hospital get taken out for the day and taken to the brothel, pub, tavern type. And it all kicks off there, and the guy faints again and he gets taken upstairs. And one of the people there, one of the traumatized veteran soldiers, used to be a doctor, this black doctor, but he couldn't make a career because he was black. And Norton speaks to him and says, the doctor tells him, Dr. Bledsoe, I think he's called. The doctor says that I was in France. He went to fight in the war and then he stayed there. So, oh yes, and how long are you in France, Mr. Norton asked. Long enough, he said, long enough to forget some fundamentals which I should never have forgotten. What fundamentals, Mr. Norton said. What do you mean? The vet smiled and cocked his head. Things about life, such things as most peasants and folk peoples most always know through experience, though seldom through conscious thought. And I thought this was interesting because it goes to the narrator in Invisible Man is a Br'er Rabbit type character. And there's a wisdom that's referred to here by the vet that the narrator finds out at his own expense because he's an intellectual, highly articulate guy. And the vet was this highly skilled doctor who did brain surgery but could never build a career. And he refers back to this Br'er Rabbit-like common sense of peasants and folk people. So then Dr. Bledsoe asked Norton what he was doing there. And he says, I came out of illness. Or rather, he brought me, Mr. Norton said. Of course, but you came and it was fitting. What do you mean, Mr. Norton said with irritation. A little child shall lead them, the vet said with a smile. But seriously, because you both fail to understand what's happening to you, you cannot see or hear or smell the truth of what you see. And you looking for destiny. It's classic. And the boy, this automaton, he was made of the very mud of the region, and he sees far less than you. Poor stumblers, neither of you can see the other. To you he is a mark on the scorecard of your achievement, a thing and not a man, a child or even less, a black amorphous thing, and you, for all your power, are not a man to him, but a god, a force. In the context, I think it's chapter 3 of the book, it's a brilliant takedown because Dr. Bledsoe gets more and more angry when he's confronted with this sick philanthropist because he sees himself as a messiah character. And the reference to destiny is that the white guy had said it's his destiny to help out this black university. And this is the flip side of when Lacan says Oedipus's blindness might be the beginning of wisdom. This is the different type of blindness. This is the blindness of people who can't see what they're doing. And it's just so well written because when he says a little child shall lead them, that's a reference to Isaiah 11:6. The wolf shall also dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. So he's saying it sarcastically. The Mr. Norton thinks he can have this happy world where everyone lives together, and he's the the munificent person who allows this to happen. And Dr. Bledsoe, the old vet, is pouring scorn on that. But also he's making a biblical reference to the narrator, Adam made from mud, the original man. But he's saying, and the boy, this automaton, he's just blind to what's going on. He was made of the very mud of the region, and he sees far less than you. And just finish off now with Richard Adams and then a couple of poems or images that will probably haunt you. So rabbits are like human beings in many ways. One of these is certainly their staunch ability to withstand disaster and to let the stream of their life carry them along past reaches of terror and loss. They have a certain quality which it would not be accurate to describe as callousness or indifference. It is rather a blessedly circumscribed imagination and an intuitive feeling that life is now. And remember, this is a child's book. I love this, the writing, and it depresses me in equal measure because of how far children's literature has sunk. I compare this to, I would upset people, but the stupid, I really am having a senior moment, the stupid wizard thing, Harry Potter. for all that people love it and how popular it is, it's got none of the depth of Watership Down, if you ask me. So to finish with two of the most miserable, downbeat. The first is descriptions. The first is Myxomatosis, this poem by Phillip Larkin. Caught in the centre of a soundless field while hot, inexplicable hours go by. What trap is this? Where are its teeth concealed? You seem to ask, I make a sharp reply, then clean my stick. I'm glad I can't explain just in what jaws you were to suppurate. You may have thought things would come right again if you could only keep quite still and wait. So it's a horrible image. And I actually saw, because I live in a country area where there was a rabbit with myxomatosis, I had to get a neighbour to kill it for me, but the eyes get congealed over with infection, so they can't see anything. It's like horrible cataracts. And Larkin's describing it's almost resonant of the way in which rabbits, one of their defense mechanisms is to just stay still. But they're staying still, just waiting to be either die or be killed by a predator. It's a horrible situation. And this is a quote from Hegel, which is the source of the final quote I'm going to give you from Jacques Lacan. So Hegel says in the Genosystem, with sickness the animal trespasses the boundary of its nature, but the sickness of the animal is the becoming of spirit. The whole organism tries to attain to the theoretical process, to the being for itself of the universal. And that, typical for Hegel, difficult, elusive. And then to start at the end with the very beginning, the quote I'm now going to show you from Lacan that was based on this is what made him think of it. The following quote is what made me think of the theme of this whole talk. And it's a little footnote 22 in an essay he did in the middle of a Cree. It's a collection of his writings. And it's a horrible, but also I think it's an important and profound description. It's enough to have seen in the recent epidemic, myxomatosis epidemic, a blind rabbit in the middle of a road, lifting the emptiness of its vision, changed into a gaze towards the setting sun. It was human to the point of tragedy. And that's my experience of having seen a rabbit. And I always thought myxomatosis was man-made. As far as I know, it isn't. It was indigenous to South America. And in South American rabbits, it's an infection that's relatively mild. It was when it was transported, so it was man-made to the extent that it was transported to Europe and thereafter to Australia. And European rabbits, and the European rabbits were the ones that colonized Australia. But European rabbits can't handle it, so they die, horribly. But just this image, a blind rabbit in the middle of a road, lifting the emptiness of its vision, changed into a gaze towards the setting sun. As a metaphor for the human condition, it was human to the point of tragedy. Well, in terms of miserable endings, I think I've set an incredibly high bar for future videos. So, on that note, I'll finish with one more appropriate image. Until the next time, all the very best.